All right. Well, we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for being here today and taking time out of your busy schedules and taking time over your lunch break to be with us today. My name is Julie Tesh, and I am the president and CEO of the Center for Rural Policy and Development. And we're just delighted to have you here today. Just for those of you that don't know, the Center for Rural Policy and Development is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that was created by the state of Minnesota in 1997. And what we do is we do research on rural policy and how policy affects rural areas. And so we're dedicated to benefiting Minnesota by providing policymakers, whether that's at the state, federal level, um, the county, city level, but providing policymakers with unbiased information and evaluation from a rural perspective. And we're very proud of our work, and we're very glad that you're all here to join us today. Today, our topic is going to be on rural small business transition. And this is a topic that, is kind of evergreen. In the rural space, we talk about farm transition quite a bit, but we don't talk about actual rural small businesses. So whether that's a hardware store, an accounting firm, lawyer, whatever it may be. And so we're really excited to be able to dive into this topic. And I will mention before I turn it over that this is being recorded and it will show up on our YouTube channel. You can just go to YouTube and type in Center for Rural Policy and Development, and it will show up there here probably by Friday. Feel free to take a look. And I will also mention that our website is ruralmn.org, and you'll be able to find the full report here along with all of our other reports. And all of it is free for you to use. We also have podcasts, blog posts, videos, the whole gamut. So please make sure to utilize those resources. We're here to help rural Minnesota. So with that, I'm very excited to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Harstad. We just started working with Sarah here in the last year or so. And she's been working really, really hard on this report and kind of opening up the topic and what it looks like policy wise for us. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Harstad. Thank you. Before we go, I should also mention, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, or actually in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those. So if you do have a question or want to have discussion, please go to the chat and make sure to ask those questions. All right, now it's you, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to pull up my screen quickly. And there we go. Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Julie, for that introduction, and welcome to everyone who's joining us. I am really grateful that you've taken some time to spend with us today to talk about this topic. I assume if you have joined us today, you are either a business owner looking at succession and exit in your future, you care about a business owner looking at succession and exit in the future, or maybe you're just curious about business succession, the process, and what rural Minnesota is going through right now. So regardless of those concepts, I'm really glad that you've chosen to spend the time with us. And if there's anything that I can share with you, it's to keep this in mind. What we're going to hear from the business owners in rural Minnesota is very aligned with the national trends that we see happening across our nation. And they include two elements that are different: context, which being that rural setting. So what does the rural business mean in its context? And then distance. The very nature of ruralness adds a distance component where our close-knit community is wonderful. And also we have a distance from a lot of resources. So those are two very key things to keep in mind as we're talking. My name again is Sarah Harstad. I have a PhD in organizational leadership. So I am interested in the intersection of strategy and how businesses function, processes, organization, and the future. I'm also an expert in leadership and leadership development. So when you put those two ideas together, I've spent a lot of time recently in business succession, and today it's about rural Minnesota business specifically. So I'm really excited to report that rural Minnesota business is open for business. We have a wonderful business environment when you look across the state. So not just in the rural areas, but across Minnesota, we have 525,000 businesses. And with those individual businesses, it doesn't just matter to one owner or to a few employees. It matters to a whole ecosystem of people. Your vendors, your bankers, your neighbors, your clients, all are impacted by the owner and the owner's business for goods, for services. What we also know is that 52,000 businesses and their owners across Minnesota are 55 years or over. And you might think that's relatively young, and it is. But in business life planning and strategy, that is sort of an age where we need to look at what happens next. What happens with the people through succession, and what happens with the business through transition and exit options. So 52,000 are sitting in that category right now across Minnesota. Those 52,000 represent 600,000 employees and up to 24 billion in payroll. So it's not a small thing that we're dealing with right now. So I say that Minnesota is open for business, but the question is for how long? The statistics show us that Minnesotans in general are familiar with succession planning and really think it's important. But yet only 19% have done work on a written plan, which is a key indicator that we're ready, a written plan in the last 3 years, which is very concerning when you consider that the first round of a sale process isn't guaranteed successful. So the only 30% of those sales close the first time. So we really are focused on how can we make that 70% more successful and move our 30% up. How are those owners feeling in the rural areas? Well, across the nation, we know that 80 to 90% of a business owner's wealth is locked in their business. So that doesn't mean that the neighbor who's a business owner specifically has that situation, but generally that's going to be the situation where in order to move into retirement and to fund the next stage of life, it's critical for that owner to adequately remove that wealth, harvest it out of their business. And this transition, this transaction, is usually the end of a lifelong process. Lots of work has gone in, blood, sweat, and tears. Process itself is pretty complex. There's one person typically internally who's motivated and is concerned and pursuing the exit planning. And then there's usually an external team, and that team includes your accountant and your attorney, your banker, your value advisor, potentially your consultant, all of these people, financial advising. So how are those owners feeling? Well, that can get to be a pretty confusing situation. There's a lot of decisions to make. The resources can be all over the place, making it tough to find. And really, the process itself is just complex to understand. So we have a need, we have a gap, and we have a little bit of confusion. Let's talk about businesses in rural Minnesota and why this has anything different than what might be occurring in urban areas. Businesses in rural Minnesota are mostly family owned or majority family owned. So we know that they have a really important implication for families. They are also considered the lifeblood of the community. Often our communities started based on farming or farm families, and they are now really surviving and thriving with those local businesses. And yes, it's because they bring those goods and services, but we're also going to talk about how these businesses are neighbors and community members. So the value of that business is so much more than the good or the service that it might be providing. As you think about this setting, we also know that most businesses in rural areas, but also across the state in general, are smaller, 50 or fewer employees. But it's important to know that there are larger groups, larger businesses out there who also fall into this category, needing succession planning, needing to go through exits and transitions. So, broad stroke of types. So, what's it like to be that owner? Well, they're leading these successful businesses, they're creating a great economy, but they have the same concerns that any business would have: the taxes, the cost to doing business, and that huge struggle that every entrepreneur or business owner has of like the daily operations. So, working in my business, and then the overarching strategic things I need to do working on my business. That's a natural tension. So owners in the rural areas face that all as well. Additionally, there's a layer of that context that shows up. So rural owners really expressed a lot of concern about being a good neighbor. And what that means is to be respectful and care for their employees, their clients, and the people that they interact with on a daily basis. So a lot of how that may show up for these business owners is through supporting local economies and through supporting local charities. In some communities, that might mean big facilities like the library or the community center. And in others, it's like smaller events or community celebrations that a business might host, maybe supporting the local booster club even. But just that importance on neighborliness and the close-knit community that overlays some of the normal business concerns. So why do people pick rural for a business? Any reason that an individual moves to rural starts with the fact that they came from it. So if we went to college and then we had grown up in a rural area, it's the number one reason that we're going to come back because we're familiar with it. But we know that families in their 30s and 40s are looking for a lifestyle. And that lifestyle includes low crime, low population density, and some affordable housing. So rural Minnesota has been pretty attractive in the last few years and has shown a slight movement of people into the rural region. So there's hope. There's people moving our direction for these businesses. Okay, let's talk to those owners. We can't pass that baton or understand it unless we've heard from them. So I had a conversation, and this research project worked by talking with former owners who had gone through the transition succession process. And most happened after 2021 until now. It seems that around 2020, because of the pandemic that was happening, a lot of transitions and transactions were maybe tabled or just put on hold because of the chaos of life at that time. And so it would make sense that many picked up then at 21 and went forward. We also spoke with business owners who had transitioned prior to that, but I think the latest would be like 2017. And across Minnesota, across industries, and across transactions. So the most interesting thing to hear out of these stories is they cover a lot of exits. There was an ESOP, there was sale to a management team, and there's transitions within family. So a very interesting cross-section of stories. What does it look like when they feel like it's been successful? Well, for the rural owner, like anyone, we need that 80 to 90% of wealth to be harvested. So financial concerns are obviously going to be at the forefront. But on top of financial concerns, there was a whole host of other issues. There was caring for my employees, making sure that my values remain in my business, maintaining my culture, having that community support remain so that this company still is a part of this community and still is a good member. And a really unique one, potentially for the rural area, is this confidentiality concern, where when there's a lot of moving pieces and communication that needs to be carefully guarded, it can be difficult to know if it's a lack of trust or a confidentiality situation. We'll talk a little bit more about that one in a moment. So we often think about the event, the moment that the business and the owner separate, or the moment that the owner and the next leader sort of transition. But in reality, this is a process. I've presented a bit of a framework for us to just think through the entire process and have the discussion around it. So 3 stages, one being we're preparing for the transition, including needing to get educated on all of my options, needing to get educated on the advisory teams that I might need. And that's where writing that plan becomes so important, where we only see that 19% doing the work. In stage 2, we're going to try to start taking some action and actually engaging with each of those members of the advisory team. In that action stage, though, as you can imagine, you could run into many, many obstacles. And so given enough time, stage 2 could be full of pivots and redirects as we take the actions to get that business, the person, and everything prepared. And then stage 3, where we usually are actually thinking about exit, but it's the end, the last stage, is the actual transition and getting across the finish line when that owner has left the business and started the next chapter, whether that's a full retirement, starting a new business, giving back to their industry, working in a nonprofit, taking care of grandkids. Stage 3 is full of opportunity. So you might think, oh, wow, that sounds very easy. That seems very possible. But as you can imagine, there's going to be barriers at each stage. So in stage 1, the primary barrier is that owners simply don't know what they don't know until they've pursued the information. So often they have one of 2 reasons for them. Triggering is the word I'll use, but maybe beginning to think about planning exit or taking exit. And that is typically that they are just tired of being business owners. There's a lot of work, a lot of stress involved. And so they might just need that to be done for this stage of life and move forward. So that's one. And then the other side of it is just realizing that this is a really wonderful thing that they have built, but they don't wish to make the next step in the business. So they may not wish to be the one who leads the next iteration of the business. It might not be the time for them to start a new process or invest in a new software. And they just realize I might not be the one for this. So it's time. So in this stage 1, your barriers are just not knowing what you don't know. So lacking the awareness and being prepared that's necessary to move to the next stages. In stage 2, the barriers really revolve around distance, and this one can cut both ways. So this transition is typically in a rural area, kind of in like a fish globe. And so people are watching frequently. That can lead to some concerns. The confidentiality that a business owner needs in order for this to be a smooth exit is of utmost importance to them. And they also want to respect all those goals that they had listed earlier. So the one part of distance is that they often want to be very transparent with their employees and their clients and their vendors, but they need to have some confidentiality, and that's tough. The second side of the distance is the need to get the advising and the team members that can help them. And this might be something they have to go farther out to find because it just doesn't exist. If you consider that one small community might have, say, one attorney, and that one attorney might have a conflict of interest because they represent both parties, suddenly we have more complexity, and one of us is going to need to go to a new community to find someone. So distance. And finally, in stage 3, the biggest concerns or the biggest barriers end up being around do we feel prepared? And can we get the deal across the line? So there's a lot of concern about that shows up at this stage in particular about, is the next leader ready? Am I emotionally prepared to step away? Can this deal finish? Is financing working? What else have I not thought of related to costs? Perhaps my taxes, what's going to happen next with all of those types of concerns. But the good news is that every barrier that we see has solutions. And although there is no perfect world, so there are going to be moments when it's not optimal or ideal, there are things that Minnesotans are trying to do to make this process smoother and easier and more successful for our owners. I'll call out just a few. It wasn't the sole point of this research project and deserves much more attention, but a few key ones that I've found along the path is the University of Minnesota Extension has amazing services for business succession and transition and community development work. And that distance barrier is being overcome in that they'll do online courses and they will meet you at your location. They'll come to your community. We are blessed in Minnesota to have the University of St. Thomas Family Business Center. Not all states have family business centers, and I'm going to argue that we have one of the best. That's a hub for families to have connection, have a cohort, learn, have support, see other people who are in similar situations. The Minnesota Center for Employee Ownership is a fantastic organization focused on employee ownership options, which tend to be more complex for people to understand and thus possibly a little bit scary, but often are a great solution. We have a unique company group, private equity in Minnesota called Granite Partners, run by Rick Bowerly. And he takes the traditional private equity, or this group takes the private equity model, which is usually buy, hold for a couple of years and sell, and has made it buy and hold for good in Minnesota. So if a platform, your company fits into that platform of companies, that's a really unique model. And that's been documented in Harvard business case studies and Minnesota case studies, University of Minnesota. And lastly, there is special nonprofits, economic community developers, consultants, certified exit planners across the state, possibly not directly in the community of the business owner, but across the state, that are just so ready, willing, and knowledgeable to help. It's about really finding them. So barriers that we see are really the lack of access to resources and preparing, the lack of clarity on all the forms because some things get very complex, the lack of appropriate advising as those rural owners need really one-on-one insight, and potentially a lack of systems, a lack of systematic process to move through succession. So let's move forward. The more attention you give to each of the stages and each of the parts, the smoother our process and the more rewarding that the outcomes are for the business owners. And the more prepared we are, the more chance that once that perfect match shows up, we'll be ready to go. Resources are available. Not all of them are only in the Twin Cities, but the majority do sit up in that territory or down, I guess, if you're in the north. But there are opportunities and options, and we have paths forward, and we are all here today to talk about what else we could do and to dig a little bit more into the succession of rural businesses. So I thank you for your time and attention, and I will turn it back over to Kate.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that presentation of that critical report. And really this discussion we're going to jump into will expand on that and dig a little bit deeper into this topic. So I'll give a brief intro while our panelists, looks like we all have our cameras on now. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Raditz, the Director of Public Relations and Communications at McClung PR. We've had the opportunity to work with the Center for Rural Policy and Development for many years now, and I'm glad to be moderating this discussion today. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into business succession coming off of this report. I will have questions for our panelists, but as Julie mentioned at the beginning, feel free to ask questions in the chat as well. And I will try to monitor that, pausing from time to time to make sure we get to those too. First, let's meet our panelists. You already heard from Dr. Sarah Harstad, a researcher for the Center for Rural Policy and Development. We have John Keimig, Executive Director at University of St. Thomas Family Business Center. Michael Darger, Extension Specialist for University of Minnesota Extension. And Kirsten Kennedy, Executive Director for the Minnesota Center for Employee Ownership. So I'm going to jump right in. Michael, let's start with you. Why do so few Minnesota businesses have succession plans? And can you talk a little bit more about some of those barriers?
Yeah, I think the basic thing is common across many kind of major life transitions that, how many people here have their will updated? How many people have their estate plan or their, durable power of attorney for medical things that come up? It's the same thing with the transition of a business. So one is that I think people need to get up in that upper right zone of Stephen Covey's, box that shows important things and urgent things. And everyone knows this is important, but getting them to get up to the upper right quadrant, which is important and urgent, because life happens, both good things and bad things. There's a lot of bad things that happen to people that start with a D: death, divorce, disagreement, disease, blah, blah. But there's also good things that happen to people. And so maybe you don't want to run the business your whole time. So I think that's just natural human nature. And in the literature, the people who've researched this topic, including us at the University of Minnesota, have consistently found that people do not have written business plans. And if you don't have if a business plan is in between your ears or a transition plan, is that really a plan? What if you can't wake up one morning and you can't talk?
Yeah. Sarah, anything to add to that?
Well, I think that Michael is right on the money with the fact that it's just a really cumbersome process to think that you want to take on. But I think some of that nature is because it feels so heavy. So when we work with individuals around succession planning or exit planning, it needs to be about more than just what are those technical things that you want to happen. It's got to be about how do you feel about this right now, and what are your hopes for the future? And when you start to consider what it means as far as hopes for the future, it might make some of those difficult pieces maybe a little less burdensome feeling and a bit more hopeful. But as Michael has pointed out, it's just a territory that's challenging, and so people do want to maybe avoid.
John, when should someone ideally start succession planning?
I think the old adage is, when was the best time to plant a tree 20 years ago? Second best time is today. There is some research out there that says, 5 to 10 years ahead of a transition. I like to view succession planning the way Sarah explained it as well, which is really this ever ongoing process. So that within that, there's a transition that happens, whether it be ownership or leadership of the business. And oftentimes those are at the same time. But it should be as early as possible, even from the inception of the business, to start understanding and laying a foundation of values. In my case, working with families, what are our family values? How do we put those into the business? How do we talk to the next generation and align ourselves on values? How do we understand what a legacy is going to look like for a business leader, a business owner, and when do we want different things to take place? So I think that ideally we're talking about all these things, getting the right people in place so that when a transition happens, maybe we don't even feel it that much. Maybe that next generation is caught up to speed in a family business, or the non-family leaders that are taking over are ready. Because I think that's one of the big things with business transition is that we don't want this moment of there's a transition. We want it to be, okay, we were expecting this, and this is how this is going to perpetuate for the future.
There was a question that came in, and they are asking, an issue that I often observe is that rural businesses have a limited number of potential successors unless it is a family member. How can rural businesses identify and transfer a business to a non-related person? Oftentimes there's a financial barrier or lack of ownership skills that are a barrier for a potential successor. Could you identify any strategies that could help in these types of situations? Is there anyone that wants to jump in on answering that question? I see a couple hands. Michael, why don't you go ahead?
I'll jump in. And first, just my favorite quote. We have a video YouTube channel on business succession and transition at the extension website, and I'll put the link in the chat. But I think my favorite quote is by a woman who successfully transferred her business, and now she's living her happily ever after. She's not a rural business, but it's Nina Hale. And if you look for some of the videos with her, she had a women's business group, and they were all leaders of businesses. There was no wannabes. It was just actual women business leaders. And they all said, if you don't have an exit plan, you don't have a strategy. And that was their way of saying, and I'm a boomer. I'm the designated boomer on this panel. Like, boomers didn't get that memo. You do need to go into business with your exit in mind. That's just a modern way of conceptualizing what it is to lead a business. So, but to go to the question from Jim, that's a great point. I mean, there is a role for people who are connectors, right? There's business brokers out there, and they are available in Minnesota. And there's other people who are connectors. So this is just something that someone needs to be thinking about all along. So, you know, if they're not in the category where they can go to the University of St. Thomas Family Business Center and really, you know, develop their skills for running a business as a family, then that is an issue. So the more they think about it and the more they can make connections, I would say also talk to their economic developers in their community, talk to their trusted business advisors, such as their accountants, lawyers, you know, business brokers and so bankers. You know, they have to kind of put that out there and make connections.
Kate,
Kirsten?
I'd like to add to that. Also, it is not uncommon for business owners to call and say, we thought we were going to transact to our children. We now are in our late 70s and our children don't want to come home and run our business. And so there are other things, right? You can go through a broker, you can sell to a competitor, you can look at private equity, you can transition to employee owned. And then once you're paid back your fair market value, you can go or you can stay. You can also do a key employee buyout. And so there are some ways to do it starting sooner than later. I have many companies call that say, I want to be done in a year. That's hard when you've done none of that prep work to be done in a year.
Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add on, those are really great points. I think that, so I am a small business owner myself. I have 112 Advising in rural Minnesota, and I had people ask me what I wanted to do next year. What was my strategic plan for 3 years from now? And I just had a blank because I didn't have an answer. It wasn't because I didn't want an answer. It wasn't because I didn't, know enough to have one. I just simply hadn't made the choice yet. So sometimes it doesn't become a choice until it's right in front of you. And what we've described then is those individuals who realize, okay, it's time for me to get out, but my child is not going to be able to take it over. They are, maybe they were the plan, but due to circumstances, they are not the plan. These are situations that I was able to talk to owners about. So there are those resources, like have been mentioned, that you just have to have the willingness to find, and those resources can help you walk through a process and come to a solution. So maybe it isn't a kid, maybe it isn't a child, a direct relative, but maybe it's a niece, or maybe it is a neighbor who you have seen grow up for many years and think could possibly have impact in your business. Preparing a leader for succession is a whole other set of duties to do, preparing someone for ownership and succession. So there's just multiple prep work. So the sooner that you have conversations with people, the sooner you find those resources, rather than I just really want to get out in 1 year.
Thank you. John, I want to go back to you because the report actually talked about the St. Thomas Family Business Center. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So we've been around for 33 years, and we were started when a family was having some issues in ownership. And one of those people, thankfully, was a trustee at St. Thomas and was going around the country to get educated with his family and said we should start a program here. And so over those 33 years, we've had more than 1,000 family businesses come through our program. And right now we have a membership of over 100, and they range from less than $1 million in revenue to I know one's over $1 billion, but about 30% of them are less than 10 million and 20% are over 100 million. So a real wide spectrum. The common theme is that they're working together in the business. So we don't have a lot of companies that are just shareholders and at that stage. And I like to say we help families deal with all the fun stuff they get to manage besides running the company. So when we think about family dynamics, transition planning, conflict resolution, governance structures, all those things. And so we put on events and programs for families to come together. Only a third of our families have any St. Thomas connection, so we are open for business under any umbrella. And most of our companies are within kind of the metro area, but we do have probably 10 or 15 that are, an hour or more away because, like Sarah said, we're the only program in Minnesota. And if you're looking for that specific family business piece, there's just not a lot of options out there for gathering with 200 other family business members.
Thank you. You know, what are some of the biggest challenges when you think about rural business owners, what they're facing considering succession, knowing, wondering if there are key differences when you're comparing urban to urban and suburban challenges to the rural. Maybe can we start with you, Kirsten? Oh, you're.
Our metro centers, great, right? Everything's close. We're doing some work bringing in it, kind of employee ownership marketplace to East Central Minnesota right now, and it's different, right? It's every county's different in Minnesota, and every city in that county is different. And so really it is finding out what makes people tick. It's knowing that if you lose a business like Rush City, Minnesota in 2020 lost their mill, 32 people lost their jobs, they did not get them back. That's a hit. Rush City had already lost their clinic and their grocery store, and they lost their job. So I just go, in greater Minnesota, it's not just, oh, we lost a company, something else will take it. It's like, they're unemployed, they have kids, and they have to make ends meet. And so I think the difference is that people are so busy running their companies, sometimes they can't go to a chamber meeting or other things. The chambers seem to be a really nice hub in greater Minnesota. We also have great support with SBDCs, our regional development commissions, and every economic development leader in each county is willing to do help too. And I think what it is they get nervous, succession planning, we are a country that never wants to die, no one wants to grow old. And so succession planning is this has been my business, this has been my baby, and who else can do it as good as I can? And so it's the resources, it's the education, and it means that we have an obligation when we serve statewide to make sure we're going out to rural communities as much as we're doing work in the metro areas.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add on to that, or I can move on?
I'll
add on.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, well, first of all, there's this for economic developers, and I think some people here are economic developers, there's this thing called business retention and expansion. And obviously business success and transition, exit planning, this is under that tent. So this is like meat and potatoes work for economic developers. If you're not already bringing up business success and business transfer in your BRE efforts, you need to start doing that. That doesn't mean that you, the EDO, the economic development officer or official, that doesn't mean you have to be the expert. And because I think what you're going to get a theme from today, from Sarah's work and from the rest of us, is that there's a lot of different sets of competency and advice and resources, and there's no right answer for every business. This is unique to the values and the situation of each business. So there's not a cookie cutter approach. So, but bringing it up in the business visits that economic developers do, and also kind of bringing it up as a topic in the community. I think Sarah alluded to confidentiality is this thing that we all need to respect confidentiality. But if you never bring this topic up, that is a problem, because there's some business owners out there who are, one, not getting this into the urgency zone, or they have assumptions, or they have knowledge that's insufficient about, like they assume, for instance, that their daughter's going to take over the business. They're not talking with her, and she's not going to come back from Minneapolis or wherever she moved after college. And they need to have those discussions. So bringing it up and John was the first person to sit for my video series. And John had here's a nice little video you can see of John called Poke the Bear. And you got to bring these things up. And I'll just give 2 examples of, Blue Earth is a very rural community in southern Minnesota. You cannot get any of their economic development resources for their business unless you have a business succession plan, period. So create your plan, then you're accessible for those resources, because they're serious about it in Blue Earth. And also Amy Schaefer, she's on my video series. She brings this up every Beery visit that she does. Now, Ramsey is kind of an ex-urban community in Anoka County. I was at the Anoka County group last month, and Sean immediately put together a one-pager resource guide for the businesses in their community of Ramsey. And I think it includes several of the people who are on the screen here. They took it seriously. And so they're not pretending that they know anything, but they're bringing it up and they're giving some specific resources to their businesses.
I think what I was going to add was a lot of what Sarah talked about of people wanting to go elsewhere maybe because of that confidentiality. So I've heard that from some of the family businesses in our program that I would consider to be in a rural community. And one woman told me that the main accountant in town was a high school classmate of hers, and she just wasn't comfortable having one option. Doesn't mean it wasn't a good option, but for her, it wasn't. And so I think when you come to the Twin Cities, there are a lot more firms, and some specialize, in my case, in family business. So I think that's a big thing. But the SBDCs were mentioned, big proponent of them. Get out there, talk with somebody as a family business, because they say entrepreneurship is lonely. I think being a family business owner in a small community is probably 10 times lonelier, because who do you go to talk about any of this? And I think, Michael's point is addressing that, is get some of this information and these resources into those community developers' hands so they can start that conversation, so people don't feel alone. And it's more of a normal thing to say, hey, we might be considering transitioning this. I've had hundreds of families come through our program in the 11 years I've been here, and only one has told me in advance of a sale. And that was only because she happened to be in one of our peer groups and said, hey, I have to bow out next year because we're in the middle of a sale. But it's just not something people talk about, and you usually find out about it afterwards. So that's a big challenge.
Sarah,
I'll add.
go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
I'll just add one last thought. And I think that one of the potential issues that we haven't really spent a lot of time with is it doesn't really, somebody used the phrase when I was talking across the state, it doesn't really hit tier 1 issue for many organizations. And so this panel group currently, it does hit a tier 1 issue. But when you consider all of the work that needs to be done in economic development, or all of the work that needs to be done in the various areas that you do get services, it's often a tier 2 or 3 thing. Like, that's just a reality, because there's other stuff that everyone has to accomplish. So I think part of the concern for business owners is, if we think about, like, who are they going to? If there is no tier 1, who are they going to? And I believe Michael's research tells us, they're accountants and they're financial advisors potentially. So those are areas that we at least start the conversation. And I just want business owners to know, like, it's a tier 1 concern for some of us, and we'll get it to be a tier 1 concern for more.
Sarah, can you go over again, just talking about the key steps involved? What are the key steps involved in creating a succession plan for a family-owned or small business, particularly in a rural community?
Yeah, I would love to start the conversation, and I think that the others will have some really great insight as well. I think that when you consider creating a succession or an exit plan, there is a variety of concerns that come up right away. But if you think about it in 3 steps, it will give you format. So step 1 is really about education. Get yourself as aware of all of your options so that rather than the assumption that I will pass it to my child or I will find a buyer or I'm going to have to sell everything because it's the end of ends, consider that employee ownership could be an option. Consider that maybe some of your managers have the skills. So learn what all of those options look like, pick a couple, and write a plan about that. Writing that plan may then take you into working with your advisors, working with an advisory team. There's another statistic that only like 65% of businesses have advisory teams built, which is understandable. But what that means is your accountant, your attorney, your financial advisor, your, guidance people need to be there in stage 1. Then in stage 2, you take that plan, you consider if your timing is aligned, and you start to put pieces in order. Like we've all mentioned, you can't necessarily sell tomorrow. So you're probably going to have to document some processes. You're probably going to have to value some assets, make some hard decisions, start a leadership transition plan, get some development happening. In that process, you might then realize option A is not the right one. I need to go to option B. So stage 2, we're putting pieces into place. Stage 3, we're down the road now, and we have the ability to exit. We have the ability to emotionally make that separation and move excited to our next stage, as well as support the new owner or whatever the requirement might be. It's unique in that setting. So that would be my best framework. There's lots of things that we could talk about within there, but simplifying, I think if you go 1, 2, 3, keep it as simple as possible to start with.
I think the key thing in your answer, Sarah, when Kate asked it, you said, I would like to start the conversation. And I think that's the piece, is starting the conversation as parents and children to say, this is what this business is. Is this something you're interested in? And then if not, I mean, if we can get that answer right away, that this isn't likely going to transition to a family member, then that's a hard shift to what are our other options. But I think it comes down to, family mission, family vision, and talking about those things. What does the family care about? Why do we want to own this thing together? And see if there's alignment there. Because those foundational pieces will really answer a lot of the other questions as you go down through these steps that Sarah outlined.
Thank you.
Sarah? And Kate, I've seen companies where they did think a son or daughter was going to take it over, or a couple of the kids, that when then they bring the kids in, they start implementing it, they realize that they don't really like it. Maybe it's not their forte. And so that's another time where I see a big kind of, oh, now what do we do?
Thank you. Michael, can you talk about what kind of gaps you see in the Minnesota ecosystem for helping businesses transfer to new owners and leaders?
Sure. One gap was that some of the people interested in this topic weren't talking to each other across both the rural and the entire state. So 3.5 years ago, I started convening a group, and John was one of the first people to say, we got to do this. But, Kirsten and Sarah and a bunch of our I call it business success and transition. So a bunch of our BST friends are part of this networking group. And so I learned about this publication that St. Thomas has, and they published me. I just put the link in the chat, and that's got both our research and it's got some tips about what business owners should do, and I think of it like it's a shotgun start on a on a golf tournament. Just start on any hole and start whacking away, because you got to go through the whole golf course. It doesn't necessarily matter where you start. Like if you play one of those tournaments, you start on hole 7, you're not your favorite hole. Like, okay, you get your swings down. By the time you get to hole 13, which you think is the most important thing, you've had some practice. But I think some of the gaps, Kate, are one, that owners aren't, aware that this is important and to start right away, whether it's 5, 10 years or more. And they don't know because they haven't had these discussions like Kirsten and Sarah talking about and John, then they don't know what they don't know. So you got to start talking about it with your own advisors, and you also have to talk about it. And that includes people like your spouse, your family, as well as people like the attorney, accountant. I already said confidentiality is a thing, and we have to respect that. But we need to bring this up, both one-on-one, like with a business that you care about, and you're just a customer, or you just value that they're in your community, or you're like, you're the number one attorney, or you're the mayor, whatever it is. You don't have to be a leader to do this. If you're a customer, an employee, how does an employee bring up this topic about, hey, boss, what's the plan for the business? Have you thought about possibly selling it to us? Now, that's something that some other people on this call are experts on, like Kirsten, and there's some people who are participating. But, I think the last thing I'd bring up is education. And as the U of M extension, we're interested in that. We do have a class for business owners. I can't get business owners to know about it and take it, but it's a good class. So for the people who do well in an educational environment, it's a practical extension class that we do through Zoom and Canvas. But we do also do education for economic developers and community leaders. So those are some of the gaps. I'm sure there's some others.
I think we have a couple of questions. First one, I think this goes back to the steps that we were talking about. How best to help a family where the owner's advisors are on step 3, but children are on step 0? If anyone wants to jump in there.
I'd be happy to jump in. Or John, do you want to start? And then I can go after
I was
you.
going to use your quote again. I would like to start the conversation. I typed that out. It's a great question. I think you just have to start talking about it and bring those kids in, see what their interest is. We have a family that's been part of our program. It's a nuts and bolts factory. Literally, that is what they make. And that one of the daughters said, growing up, I never wanted to work at the nuts and bolts factory. And she went and got a degree in something else, but later realized, hey, I can use my skills here. And she's now the president of a very large company with, I think, 14, 15 locations. But it was having that conversation with dad in this case that brought the kids in and said, here's what it means to work here. Here are the opportunities to work here. And here's what it means to be an owner. We've had families that have come to our program at times where their kids are on step 0, and they're using us as kind of a monthly meetup to engage and say, is this something you want? And sometimes those kids come to the business because they've got a professional career elsewhere. And sometimes they say, you know what, our kids aren't that interested. Thanks. We've done a year here and really there's no point to continue. And I agree with that. So it's having that conversation, understanding what it means to be an owner, if that's an option, because that is different than just leading the business, but also what could your role be in the business? And that doesn't mean they have to be the CEO. So again, it's just, there's a lot of conversations that have to happen. And if you can do those and get to step 1 with the kids, then I think you've got a chance. But if they are stuck on step 0, call Kirsten.
Nice.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
I saw you both. Go ahead.
Kirsten, did you want to go?
I did. So it is, whether it's the kids or say key employees sometimes reach out because they go, our owner's almost 80 and there's no plan. So it is sometimes educating separately, right? Separately educating about what the plan is and just meeting people where they're at, right? Because if they're afraid, or I'm Norwegian, I'm a hugger, but no one else in my family is, they don't share information. They don't tell you what's going on. And so I think it's part of that, right? It's the culture we bring. And then when you're in greater Minnesota, that community becomes everything to you, right? If you're a business owner, you do sponsor things, you help people, you mentor, you're a big chamber member. And so I think it is the education, and then access to support And most people don't even know there is support in Greater Minnesota. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to add one last thing too?
Yeah, and I think that those are really wonderful. I guess the thing that I would be concerned about is probing, like, what does zero mean to that kid? Does that mean that nobody has talked to them? Does that mean that they are not interested? Does that mean that this is not the skills that they have? I'd kind of be curious about what that is. And also, the one of the interviews that we conducted was with not going to a kid, but going to a management team, like Kirsten was just talking about. And so these key folks did buy the business and take over. And it was not an easy to understand process. So they had to bring in help. And that can look like whomever has the education and the process and the plan to help you. It can be an advisor, like the independent consultant, or it can be the accountant if they have some expertise. So just kind of talking to the ones that you're most comfortable with to start the conversation. John, thank you. And then learning what you don't know and kind of moving forward from there, knowing there's lots of options and lots of paths, but development paths can be built. That can be taught and trained.
Couple of more questions in the chat. This question, has anyone's team done work on appropriate or typical sales exit multiples? For example, I have seen 3 to 4 times earnings put forth in an ETA, entrepreneurship through acquisition search fund context. Some online sources support that number, but logically it seems low. I recognize that location, industry, and best alternatives are likely factors.
Well, I haven't done work in that area, but I would say that the exit planners, the people who have SEPA certification, that's the Certified Exit Planning Association, that's what SEPA stands for. So exit planners have some experience with that, and we have some exit planners on my video, on my YouTube channel. And I guess there are some pecking orders out there that the exit planners talk about. So for instance, they'll talk about a strategic buyer as being associated with the highest multiple. And a strategic buyer is someone who's in the same industry, and they want to either buy you out for your accounts, your employees, to take over your business as a going concern, or just to take the intellectual property, or whatever it is that they see as an asset that's valuable to them. But they're a competitor. They're a person in the same industry as you. And so, but what, in this research that we did last year at the University of Minnesota, we asked business owners about these factors. And what I meant by factor was, what do you care about? And so what we find is that some owners care more about the ultimate, their personal financial situation. Other businesses, and that's understandable. That makes sense, right? They have to take care of themselves and their family. But other owners will have a higher value for the business's financial success, the business's longevity, keeping the business in the community, keeping good jobs for the current employees. And so you can find all that data in our research. We surveyed about 300 business owners across the whole state last year. And so I get data dashboards and stuff. But I just want to put out there that, concern for the net proceeds of the sale is one thing, but there's all these other things that they can be concerned about too. And so that can affect which transfer route they want to look at. So I'll just give an example. I won't say where, but we had an IT firm owner who was, I think, a little bit older than me. I think he looked like maybe he was pushing 70. You never really know over a Zoom thing, right? But he was kind of that strong silent type. And so he was thinking about, I think he was thinking about a strategic buyer. That's what he was thinking about going into the class. But coming out of the class, we did expose the people in the class to the 3 forms of employee ownership that Kirsten's Center for Employee Ownership kind of promulgate. They say, ESOPs, worker cooperatives, and employee ownership trusts are 3 ways that they suggest. They're not saying what to do, but in taking the class, he thought, a worker cooperative, selling to my employees where they all own it cooperatively. He had never considered that. So he's still thinking strategic buyer, but in thinking about his values and what he cared about. So it's really interesting to see that, right?
I have one thing to add too. Employee-owned companies, for instance, plastic products in Lindstrom, Minnesota, they can do acquisitions, right? So they sometimes, and they don't even have to buy a company in their own field, like we were talking about, that's strategic. So there are ESOPs, for instance, employee stock ownership plan companies that will then acquire other companies. So Windings Inc., for instance, in southern Minnesota, they are on fire with acquisitions, and they are not just buying in what they do. They make concept motors for like NASA. They have something going around the sun right now, but they have bought other companies that do not do that. So that is also for an owner that just wants out, doesn't really want to go to private equity, and no one's going to come in and fire everyone. They might decide, oh, we have to share accounting or something. But that also is just another little caveat for people looking on a quick.
Great, thank you. Another question in the chat. What kinds of resources exist for informed business valuation?
Oh, and I'll take a stab at that. I'm not an expert on these things, but I will say that this is a very important topic. And so a business owner should be getting an external professional valuation by a person who knows what they're doing, and you can get accreditation in this field. So they bring in this neutral, unbiased. It's just like getting your house appraised, right? You need to have an expert. The bank won't accept one that's not a certified appraiser. Same for businesses. So I put a link in that Q&A thing. I put a link in there, I think, of a National Association of that. You can like set up diameter, and you can look for people who are members of that professional valuation association. But I also suggested, if you can't see that, talk to your local attorney or accountant, business broker, someone that you trust who's experienced in this topic, because lawyers and accountants, they specialize, right? So you want to get someone with experience in this area of business transfer and ask for some suggestions from them. And I couldn't tell you, even if I did, because the university is neutral on these topics, so I couldn't tell you who to use.
And to do that every few years.
Yeah.
Because the number of people that say I've got a $10 million business and then they find out it's not, we don't want that.
That
And I do,
oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to add that I do think this ends up being just like a pain point, because it can be expensive, it can be thorough, it can be higher, that's exciting, it can be lower, that's devastating. So in general, the valuation typically in that early education stage can be something like, as a certified exit planner, you can do rough estimate, but then when you get to the serious stage of action, yeah, you're going to need a formal valuation, and that's just a part of this process.
And
Okay.
oftentimes owners, when they hear it's going to cost between 10 and 25,000, they just in their minds go, do I really want to put that money out if I'm not going to do it? So also finding ways to do not a take to the bank, but most companies that come through MNCEO think they're worth a lot more than they are. And the National Center for Employee Ownership actually has a calculator on their site that people can use, not to take to the bank, but to kind of get an idea. Finally, what I will say is then owners leave and then they come back later and go, oh, I guess I wasn't worth as much as I thought.
That it leads a little bit of what I was going to ask John. I think Michael, you touched on this a little bit, but talking about how important is it for business owners to involve legal and financial advisors in the succession process, and what are some common mistakes made when businesses skip that step? John, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. I think the number one thing I hear from financial advisors who work with family businesses is that mom and dad are not ready to retire, because so often they just continue to build the business, and they might not be paying themselves what they're worth, or, their 401k for the 4 decades that they were doing that. And there is one study that's out there that looked at businesses that failed in the next generation. And the top reason that was given, caveat, they asked that next generation where it failed under, but they said that it was because mom and dad or one of them still needed financial resources from the business once they had exited the business. And I do know some families that do that. And that's part of maybe gifting a business that the kids can't afford to buy. But then it's, hey, I need my current salary for another 5 years. And that can be really detrimental to a smaller business. So I think that's on the finance side. On the legal side, I think just make sure you have your business documents up to snuff, that your estate planning's ready. Tax reasons, you don't want to give too much to Uncle Sam. The death tax, as it is often called, to make sure that if somebody does get hit by a bus, that the business doesn't necessarily have to be sold if it is something you want to keep in the family. So getting a good attorney, getting a good financial advisor, and by good I mean people that will push back, that know their skill set really well, but also understand, in our case, family business dynamics and what makes sense. Because there are some of them that the company has grown so much, and the next generation just can't afford it. So what does that mean? And maybe your parents gifted it to you, and you want to gift it to your kids, but financially you can't necessarily do that. So what does that mean? So I think there's just a lot of those questions that getting some outside advisors to poke a little bit is a good thing to get the right answer for you.
Kirsten, what impact does business succession have on the local community in Minnesota?
Well, as mentioned, if a business closes, it's a big impact. And I think what it is that it's about, right, keeping employees, right, keeping workers. We're all going to be fighting for workers. We are drowning in the silver tsunami right now. It's about keeping that in the community, those dollars. So a small business, while in the metro, might have hundreds of small businesses around them. Our main streets, many of which are struggling right now. Those are the smaller businesses. I just met with some owners up on Mille Lacs Lake, and they're trying to figure out how to stay open and not sell to private equity because they can't get workers. So I think what it is we know the nuts and bolts. It's taking that imagination to say, how can we do workarounds? So if someone comes to any of us, I know where to send them. If it's a family business that comes through, I go, oh, go to John at the Family Business Center. He has a group. So really what it is too, I think, is it is the lifeblood of many communities. And when they have a strong business, it's great. You never want it to go away. And I think that it's about making sure they have what they need, right? That they know that there's gap funding if they need it, right? If they want to do something or grow, sometimes there's grants for equipment, but if they don't go to learning opportunities, they don't know. So it's really about meeting people where they're at and figuring out how they digest information and then getting it to them. And sometimes that's one-on-one meetings.
Thank you. Excuse me. Michael, can you talk about just how ready are Minnesota owners today for business succession and transition? And what are you seeing in terms of the next 10, 20 years, what the outlook of that readiness is?
Okay, great. We did this research with the 300 business owners last year. And what we found was that on a 6-point scale, where 6 is to a great extent and 1 is not at all, then the business owners across Minnesota who answered the survey, and it was a pretty good response. So we feel that you can project it to the population of hundreds of thousands of businesses, like Sarah was talking about. We found that they're right in the middle. And there's 2 kinds of readiness. One is the readiness of the business, which is over here, right? And then there's the readiness of you, the owner. And those are 2 different things. And if they're not 2 different things, then you don't have a transferable business. So we measured both of them, and we found it was just about a 3.6, which is just like a half a tenth over the midpoint, right, between a 1 and a 6. But when we looked at, I want to go back to this question of advisors, because there's literally dozens of types of advisors. You could get like personal counselors, psychologists involved here, family therapists. The obvious people are the accountants and the attorneys and the personal financial planners, bankers. And so we measured all those, and we correlated that the readiness of the business and readiness of the owners with what types of advisors they use. And on a statistically significant basis, we found that those businesses, now we're talking about business readiness here, for the business readiness metric, we found that the business owners who used accountants, attorneys, and talked to their spouse/partner, those businesses, if they used all three, and those are three of the top 4 advisors in our research. Other business owners was like the other one that's in there, but of these 3 were statistically correlated to moving from less than the midpoint on business readiness, so like about a 3.4 to up to like a 4.6 something. So that went from like being less than ready to, right between the 4 and the 5 on that scale. And that's, again, that's a self appraisal. So when you talk to business, when I do workshops and there's economic developers and trusted business advisors in the room, they will guess that their client businesses are at a lower level of readiness for the business or personal, but that's informal. On this formal research, the businesses moved ahead. And this is interesting because my predecessor, Liz Templin here, she's retired, but she did our first major research about 7 years ago. And she studied deep rural business succession. And her research papers are still on our extension website. But she found that the average, so she looked backwards. My research was with owners looking out the front window, like, how are you getting ready? She looked out the rear window, and she had business owners who had successfully purchased someone else's business and kept it going for 3 years. And her number one advisor for her research was bankers, which makes sense, right? Because the financing is super important when you're actually going to do the deal. But she found that the average number of advisors was 3 to 5, and the actual mean was just about 4. So you had to have 4 separate advisors to do these rural business transfers, right? And the range was 3 to 5. So the whole notion that one person is sufficient is out the window. You need to be thinking about it takes a village to transfer a business, and forget about the DIY. This is not a time for do-it-yourself. This is a time for professional advisors. Not everyone can afford some of these advisors like exit planners, but go talk to your small business development center and get recommendations. So.
Thank you. Just keeping an eye on the time. Sarah, how can business owners balance family dynamics with business needs, especially when multiple heirs are involved, or if some are uninterested in continuing the business?
I just still have to chuckle at that. This is not a DIY experience, because I think that is very accurate. And when we're in family business, we often do want it to be DIY. I'm not going to say that right, but that is our hope. We have started a business and own a business because we want not necessarily the control, but some of that independence. And so when it comes to the state where I'm going to pass it to my next generation, I want to independently do that with them. And so I want to independently prepare them. So family business research and best practice does show that you can have a suite of heirs and do a variety of individuals into the right roles. The most important part being that they have distinct responsibilities and empowerment. However, that is really challenging to have more than one person run point. So typically a family will go through sort of a process of evaluation and have conversations like, who has what skill set and who has what interest area, and then how can we align so that perhaps you're the chair of the board, but you are the CEO or something along those lines. So maybe you're operational, but you're more leadership. And so we'll get you categorized as family members come through the ranks. Another way that businesses will approach this, though, is to do a process similar to a hiring process and prepare the number of heirs that they have and select and promote essentially the one who is willing to do it, who is also skilled to do it. And so, there are definitely development plans and consultants who can help with that process. There's education that's available. And I would say this might be one that John has some ideas on as well. I'm guessing that his education programming has covered topics like this.
Yeah, we try to do it pretty regularly, really, because that's when business and family dynamics overlap too much. it can be a problem. I think there's a strong benefit to bringing family to business, and it is those shared values and long-term outlook. But I think you need to have real transparent communication, clearly defined roles. This is what it means to be an owner. This is what it means to be the marketing manager. This is what it means to be the president. This is what it means if you just want to be part of the family, and to set realistic expectations. I think, you know, those conversations that we have in the family are different than the ones we have in the business, and need to be different than what we have as owners. And a lot of times all those things kind of blend together when it's the founder, but as you start going down in generations, then they start spreading apart a little bit more. Because if, let's say, there are two brothers that are looking to take over from mom, and they do that, and mom has been making all the decisions, now how do these two brothers determine who's going to make the big decisions? What about their kids? One of them has 3 kids, one has 2. What does it mean to be owners there? How are we going to balance this? So who becomes that primary decision maker in that next generation is a big question. And sometimes it is getting a board of advisors together or a board of directors together. Oftentimes the board of directors is made up of family members that are owners, or prospective owners. But what about bringing in outside advisors or directors that are not part of the family, that have a fiduciary responsibility? So there's this whole kind of path that you can take in all these different levels of what we would call governance. But it's a matter of where are you right now and what's working, but then to take a look to the next generation and say, okay, this generation is going to look a lot different than us. How do we make decisions? How do we talk together in this family circle, this ownership piece, and as a business? And it's not easy, but when done well, I think it can be super rewarding and really a cool thing for families that keeps them together through that business.
I think my last question, and this will be for all of you to answer, and that is, what key takeaway would you tell people tuning in? What is the one thing you would want to leave them with on this topic, given just your perspective, closing thought? And feel free to shout out if there's a project you're working on or anything like that that could be offered as a resource as well. Sarah, I'll go in order of the speakers I have. So I'll start with Sarah.
I think that my single most important takeaway would be that our rural owners don't have to be afraid to stick their hand and their head up and say, I need help. I would like a resource or two, who can even start the process. It doesn't necessarily need to be a big financial commitment. It can just be, I need to know more so I can make some really good choices. So my best takeaway would be to not be afraid, even though we've been independent for so long, and that's the way these businesses run, to take the first step of asking for input from others.
Great.
And
John.
thank you.
Yes, thank you. John.
I'm going to go back to my quote of the day from Sarah. I would like to start the conversation. I just think that I beat that drum all the time. We were talking about kind of the percentage of people, business owners that have a succession plan, and I pulled data from our center this year, and 40% say they have a formal plan. Another 50% say they have an informal plan. So 90% of them, which is really high and was surprising to me, have said, I would like to start the conversation, and they've done that. And so I think that key is getting going on that process. Your outcome, all of these options we looked at for a transition are all on the table, but starting the conversation is where it needs to be.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I'll build on that theme of reaching out. And some people are joiners and some people are not joiners. Any chamber director, and John's in that situation, having members. And how do you reach the people who are not members, those people who are not proactive or don't want to pay that fee or whatever it is? I would say, so I think most of the people on the call are probably like economic developers and regional development, local leaders, and people who are just interested in rural development in general. People who follow CRPD events. I would say reach out to any of the people on the screen here, other people you've seen make chat comments. You probably see some people you recognize, but there's no one person or organization who is sufficient. All of us are important. And you have to find it's a just-in-time thing, right? Like these advisors who will help businesses, they don't have to be helping at the same time. It's like the right person at the right time. So I would say, reach out, to those of us who are trying to offer resources. But I would also say, reach out to businesses you're not sure about. Maybe you need to do it in private. Maybe you sit down with them at their shop, or you say, can we have coffee, and say, let's look at this video on the extension website, or let's look at this report that Sarah wrote. Whatever it is, what's the right tool? You send them a text, but reach out in both directions. You can tool yourself up, but you can also reach out to the businesses and show that you care.
And Kirsten.
I'm going to do a shout out to our chambers of commerce in Greater Minnesota. When I was mayor in North Branch, our chambers were where we got all of our information for our business owners. And so just having them start the conversation, maybe once a quarter, they can do just some learning and understand there are online ways they can learn, they can read. They just have to reach out to one of us and we can get them the resources. I always say, I'm not an expert, but I know a lot of experts. And so reach out, it's there, and we're working hard to really create more access in Greater Minnesota and understanding. So education is going to be the best thing. So meet people where they're at, whether it's one-on-one, online learning, books. Some owners want to just peruse for a while, right? They don't want to talk to anyone yet. And so whatever we can do to give them information that they can digest, I think it's a win.
Great. Thank you so much. And I want to just say thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your time and offering your expertise and thoughts. Thanks to Dr. Harstad for all of your work on this report. If any of what you heard today was interesting to you, the report is on the Center for Rural Policy and Development's website. If you go there, it's under research reports. Please continue to follow for their research reports and stay involved in these events if today was interesting to you. And I believe the recording of this webinar will also be on the Center for Rural Policy and Development's YouTube page as well when it has processed and gets up there. So thanks everyone and have a great day.